Are here, and if you're following along online, we're glad you are following along online. Hello, Rita. Glad that you are with us. She's in Ohio today, but she's going to be listening to Sabbath School and Church today, so we welcome you. Let's see, what can I say about this week? Well, Thursday morning, Rita took Dixie and went to Ohio. So they are away this weekend. They'll be back hopefully by Tuesday evening. Let's see, what else can I mention from this past week? All right, I have somebody.
Well, I'm glad to say that I took my first flight this last week to Florida and home again, and I had a great time.
You flew for the first time?
And I know my church family was praying for me, so I made it.
and I didn't even get a chance to say, hope the plane doesn't crash, and obviously it didn't. Well, good for you. Glad you had a safe trip there and back. Cousin Link.
Well, I've taken care of a German Shepherd this week. That's anything new, because I was flown down here the first time I was on a big plane.
There you go.
To take care of the dog and everything else a few years ago, and that's when my stepdaughter told me I was moving down here.
And here you are.
But this week I'm there taking care of the dog and the house and the thing. And the dog was missed them so bad that she would not eat.
Oh, boy.
Sharon called me up, and I said, well, I'll give her a little bit of some. The night before, she didn't eat her night meal until the morning. And then I gave her a little bit about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and she did eat that. And then this morning, I put a full dish out. Now she eats string beans and tomatoes and watermelon and cantaloupe and oatmeal and you name it, she's a vegetarian. She does get a little bit of chicken. She had that big dish empty.
Whoa.
The time it took me to go to the bathroom and fix my beard and stuff, I come out and it was gone.
It was gone. She ate it.
But
Good
now
deal.
I was considering maybe I ought to stay home. I've got the children's story. I said, I got to go.
That's right.
Because I don't want her to get all,
Yeah.
they're like a child.
Well,
Just like a child.
well,
So that's going to be my week.
there's your week. Our cat is not eating, and maybe it's because Rita is not in the house. And she views Rita as the person to feed her. If I feed her, she just looks at it and me. Brother Dwayne, sorry to hear about your dad. I mentioned that last week in Sabbath school, but you weren't here. You are here today, so sorry to hear about your dad. All right, let's have a word of prayer, and then we're going to begin our study. Father in heaven, thank you for the blessings of this past week. Thank you for taking Rita and Dixie safely to Ohio. Please bless them while they're there and bring them home again safely. And I pray for Dwayne, and I pray for the other folks that have mentioned things going on in their lives. I pray that you would bless us as we study together this day. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, 2 weeks ago, we studied about William Miller, the 2300-day prophecy. That was pretty much what the whole lesson was about. Then the next week, which would have been last week, we talked about how they solved the issue of what had happened on October 22, 1844, it obviously was not the second coming of Jesus, but they knew the prophecy was right. It was the event that was wrong. The cleansing of the sanctuary was not the destruction of this earth by fire at the second coming of Jesus, as most people believed in that time. Rather, it began the great Day of Atonement in the heavenly sanctuary. And we talked about the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, as it's practiced now, as it has been practiced for thousands of years on this earth. And then we talked about the great Day of Atonement. The great day of Yom Kippur goes on in heaven even now. On October 22, 1844, so often we call it the investigative judgment, but the Bible does not use that term. Sometimes we call it the pre-Advent judgment, but the Bible does not use that term. The Bible uses the term judgment. There has to be a judgment before Jesus comes, because when Jesus comes, he's ready to separate the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats, the saved from the lost. That's all been decided. So the judgment has to take place before Jesus' coming. And that's what started on October 22, 1844. Jesus went from the holy place of the heavenly sanctuary to the most holy place. This week sort of continues that same thought. What's going on in heaven that we can't see? But the Bible gives us little glimpses of it. And last week, I mentioned Hiram Edson. He was the individual who first saw what had happened in heaven, what the mistake was, a mistake of event, not of time. And he shared it with the other early Advent believers. And that's what we're going to continue to study today. I want us to read a verse. I will read several verses. I need a reader. Somebody to read Exodus 25:16. Just not Doug. I've got another verse for him. So find a different reader. Somebody to read Exodus 25:16. We'll be back with you, Brother Doug, in a few minutes, but somebody else to read Exodus 25:16, please.
Exodus 25:16, and you shall put into the ark the testimony which I will give you.
All right. That's God's direction to Moses of where he was to put the Ten Commandments. Now, we know the story. We're not going to read it all, but Moses climbed up the mountain, actually made 2 or 3 trips up the mountain, but he climbed up the mountain carrying 2 tables of stone. And every painting you've ever seen of that shows Moses lugging a couple of great big tombstone-sized stone tablets up there. No, that's totally inaccurate. Probably each of them were about 6 inches high, 4 inches wide. He could easily carry them in one hand. So don't think tombstone size. That's not right. So he goes up with these 2 tablets of stone in his hand. And what does God write on them? 10 Commandments. What does he write with? He engraves them, if you please. with his finger. When Moses gets back to the foot of the mountain, what's he do with them? Threw them on the ground, smashed them to pieces. Why? Because they had already broken the law. The law they had said, all that the Lord commands we will do. 40 years later, or 40 days later, they're dancing naked around the golden calf. They had completely destroyed the whole idea of it. Moses goes back up the mountain with 2 more tables of stone. What does God do with these tables of stone? Same thing exactly. He writes on them with his finger the 10 Commandments. With the finger engraving on them. Imagine it'd be like to see that. Something that God actually wrote on stone with his finger, engraved them. And as God had given the directions, he was to put them into the ark. He did. The Ark of the Covenant contained the 10 Commandments. These 2 small stone objects engraved with the finger of God, listing the 10 Commandments. Where are they today? Where's the Ark of the Covenant that was in the sanctuary in the wilderness? Where is it today? We don't know. Remember years ago when what was that movie came out about finding the Ark of the Covenant? Well, of course, it was all imaginary. It hasn't been found. But it was secreted somewhere. But there is another ark, as Brother Doug has already alluded to, in heaven with the 10 Commandments in it, written with God's finger. Let's look at Revelation 11:19, and I need somebody to read that, please. Brother Chris, thank you for volunteering. Revelation 11:19.
Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the ark of his covenant. And there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and a severe hailstorm.
All right, so that's talking about the temple in heaven. And I asked last week or the week before as we studied these things, how many of you, before you became Seventh-day Adventists, were aware of the temple in heaven? And it was pretty unanimous, never heard about it. It's just something that other denominations don't mention, but the Bible clearly talks about a temple in heaven. And here, we can see the Ark of the Covenant in God's temple, and what's inside the Ark of the Covenant? 10 Commandments. So we see them on earth, we see them in heaven. The Ark of the Covenant, the purpose of it was to be a place to hold the 10 Commandments. Now, above the Ark of the Covenant was the mercy seat, showing that mercy and justice meet right there, above the 10 Commandments, in the Ark of the Covenant. Now think about the 10 Commandments. If you were writing them, first one would be about this big, second one would be about this big, third one would be about this big, fourth one would be about this big, fifth one, sixth one, seventh one, eighth one, ninth would be about this big, 10th one would be about this big. When you take all those lines Which one comes right in the middle of them? Which one? Fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment. Now, I didn't actually count the lines. Maybe somebody's counting them right now to see how accurate that would be, but it would seem to me that the Sabbath commandment would pretty much be right in the middle, going by the size of them, the amount of writing involved. So, in the heavenly sanctuary is the Ark of the Covenant, in it the Ten Commandments, the mercy seat above it, all of that looking forward to when Jesus comes. And until then, he's given us the Sabbath for us to remember. You know, it's interesting. The only commandment that starts with the word remember is the fourth one, the Sabbath commandment. And most of the professedly Christian world says forget about it. God says remember it. That's significant. All right. Some time ago, we had 21 people sitting here, and they read Psalm 119 out loud so that all of us could follow along and listen. They read whatever version of the Bible they chose to read from, and they just read it. We actually needed 22 people, but one person, Mike, was good enough to read 2 sections, 16 verses instead of 8 verses, so it came out perfectly because he did that. But anyways, we listened to the reading of Psalm 119. We read the whole thing. That was the quarter we studied the Psalter, and I hope we never forget what we learned then, because there are some very important things about the Psalter that we need to never forget. Well, let's mention some of them. How many chapters are there in the Psalter? None. Who said that? You're right, none. There are no chapters in the Psalter. There are 150 separate psalms, but they're not chapters, they're psalms. What is a psalm? What is a psalm? It's a song. So the Psalter is the songbook or the hymnal of the Bible. 150 different songs in the Psalter. We don't know the tune of any of them. Sometimes you'll hear of, I have, people that try to put music to the Psalms. It doesn't work well. It doesn't work well because we use a certain scale. And I got down and played it on the piano. Starting at middle C, we go, starting at C, whole note, half note, whole note, half note. Now, why do we do that? I have no idea. Who is our musical expert here that can explain to me why that sounds right to my ears to do it that way? It makes no sense to me, but it's the way we do it. But that's not the way the Hebrews did it. They had all whole notes in their scale, which I would much prefer. So there's no way we could ever match how the Psalms were originally written, because they use a totally different scale than we do. Well, we could say a lot about the Psalms. That's not our study today. I need another reader, and this one I need to read Psalm 111, 7 and 8. You know, while we're turning there, before we read Psalm 119, I asked the crowd if anybody knew what Psalm 119 was about. And Sister Coyle gave the immediate answer, and she was right. What is Psalm 119 about? I heard it. What is it? The law. The law. That's what it's about. But Psalm 119 is not the only place that the law is mentioned. So let's listen to Psalm 111, verses 7 and 8.
The words of his hands are verity and judgment. All his commandments are sure. They stand fast forever and ever, and are done in truth and righteousness.
All right. Sometimes they're called precepts, but it means they're the law. They're steadfast forever and ever, done in faithfulness and uprightness. Now I need the same person, please, to read Psalm 119, verses 42, and I'll give you the other one after you read 42.
So shall I have wherewith to answer him that reproacheth me, for I trust in thy word.
And now go back to verse 172.
My tongue shall speak of thy word, for all thy commandments are righteousness.
All right, so what is the psalmist's attitude about God's law? Pardon? Okay. Yeah, it's righteous, it's holy, we should keep it, we should love it, we should do it. That's it right there. Did you read Monday's lesson? I found this fascinating. Page 74 in your quarterly. The author writes, Seventh-day Adventists follow in the footsteps of the Protestant reformers who upheld the sanctity of God's law. Note this powerful affirmation of John Wesley. Now, what church did John Wesley found? Methodist, very good. The Methodist Church. Now, there is today a church that's called the Wesleyan Church. They're very, very similar to the Methodists. They would be. They had a division years ago, and so now there's a Wesleyan church and a Methodist church. But they were founded by John Wesley. Listen to what John Wesley, who founded the Methodist Church, what he wrote. The ritual or ceremonial law delivered by Moses to the children of Israel, containing all the injunctions and ordinances which related to the old sacrifices and service of the temple, our Lord indeed come to destroy, dissolve, and utterly abolish. And that's true. That's true. He goes on to say, but the moral law contained in the Ten Commandments and enforced by the prophets, he did not take away. It was not the design of his coming to revoke any part of it. This is a law which never can be broken, which stands fast as the faithful witness in heaven. Every part of this law must remain in force upon all mankind and in all ages, as not depending either on time or place or any other circumstances liable to change, but on the nature of God and the nature of man and their unchangeable relation to each other. And I say amen. Well put. That was in a sermon that John Wesley preached. And he's absolutely right. The Ten Commandments are eternal. What about before the giving of the law? Did the Ten Commandments exist? Well, they didn't exist on tables of stone, but they still existed, and people understood them and followed them, and we still do today. And at the heart of the Ten Commandments is the Sabbath commandment. Some of you were not always Seventh-day Adventists. So when you became Seventh-day Adventists, you had to go from worshiping on Sunday, as you had always done, to worshiping on Sabbath, which was a whole new concept to you, a strange concept. And one might say, well, what's the big deal about a day? But I'd rather hear from you, those of you that came from another background. What did the people that you used to worship with on Sunday, what did they have to say about your becoming Sabbath keepers? Well, I saw the hand, Brother Doug, and I understand. Okay, Brother Ron.
Well, I've always worshipped on the Sabbath, but I work with a doctor that's Muslim, and we were there was several in the room talking about Sunday and referring to it as Sabbath. And he looked at me and said, "That's not Sabbath."
That's right, it's not Sabbath. He's absolutely right. Now, there was a time when people would refer to Sunday as the Sabbath. Civil War is my thing, and I just read a great, excellent history about Thomas Jackson. You may remember him as Stonewall Jackson, but Thomas Jackson, who is a very religious man, he always referred to Sunday as the Sabbath. But almost nobody in the last 200 years almost has referred to Sunday as the Sabbath. You just don't hear that hardly ever. Doctor?
Yes, I was young. I was 16 when I came to the church. But I visited Pentecostal, did the first communion after, then was assisting to the Presbyterian church, and then like a year studying with Jehovah's Witness. And even though I wasn't established into the activities of the churches, I don't remember mentioning much about any day other than meeting on Sunday morning and listen to the sermon and the worship. But after that, I don't remember ever anyone, pastor, elder, making a point that this is the Sabbath of the Lord or this is any different day other than coming to church. And after leaving the church, it was a day as usual. Only when I studied with the Seventh-day Adventists and came to the church, realized the difference. That this is a different day in attitude, in behavior, in looking for what to do, etc.
Yeah. And I've heard my wife tell her story, how the Church of Christ pastor preached about the Ten Commandments. And he made the point that the Ten Commandments are still binding today. So as Rita leaves, she shakes hands with the preacher and then says to him, if the commandments are still binding, why don't we keep the Sabbath? And he said, we worship on Sunday because that's the day Jesus rose from the dead. Now, some of you may have heard that same answer, but I hope you realize that the answer doesn't go with the question. The question is, why don't we keep the Sabbath? And he said, we go to church on Sunday because that's the day Jesus rose from the dead. She was not satisfied. Of course she wasn't. So she wrote to an individual you may possibly have heard of, known as Billy Graham. And she got a letter back. And in the letter, whoever wrote it, I'm sure Dr. Graham himself did not, but whoever wrote it said, we worship on Sunday because that's the day Jesus rose from the dead. Again, the answer didn't go with the question, and she recognized that, but her attitude then was, well, these men know more about the Bible than I do, so she let it go. For years, until she met me. But yeah, that was what she was told by two different individuals who did not know each other, who did not have any correspondence with each other, but they both gave the same answer. Cousin Link.
Up in, not far from where I was living in Mountjoy, there's a town up above there is Elizabethtown. And a good friend of mine goes there. He was superintendent of the Pennsylvania church schools for a number of years, and then he moved down to Maryland, school teacher for years. And he got to be friends with the pastor of, it's either Mennonite or a Brethren church. I'm not sure. It might be Brethren. A lot of Brethren there too. It's one of those conservative churches. And he got to be good friends with him. And he started holding meetings for the ones that couldn't get to Hershey to church, using that church. And he got to be friends with him, and the pastor said, well, my family and I keep the Sabbath. He says, Sunday I'm working. And he is working. He's the pastor of the Sunday church. But he says he and his family keep the Sabbath at home. Well, good. He recognizes it. He's got to start preaching it sometime.
Exactly. Where did we, who remembers, where did we as Seventh-day Adventists get the Sabbath? Who did we get it from?
From the Baptist.
Seventh-day Baptists. Rachel Oakes, if you want to actually put a name with it. Rachel Oakes was a Seventh-day Baptist. And she's the one that brought up the issue to Frederick Wheeler in church. And that's how we became Sabbath keepers, was because of Rachel Oakes, a Seventh-day Baptist, presenting the Sabbath to us. Where do we get the notion of the second coming? From whom?
Seventh-day Adventist people.
Where did we get the idea of the second coming? From what person?
Oh,
William Miller.
yeah.
What church did he belong to? The Baptist Church. So we got the Sabbath from Rachel Oakes, a Seventh-day Baptist. We got the second coming from William Miller, a Baptist. Whoa. Have you ever noticed that Seventh-day Adventist doctrine is most closely similar to Baptist? Now you know why. Because that's where we got our two primary doctrines, the Sabbath and the second coming, was from Baptist people. Yes.
Well, I grew up in a Baptist church.
Yes, you did.
And I must have read Genesis hundreds of times. And I know that the seventh day was in the creation.
Yeah.
But it never registered with me. And people who go to church on Sunday, they worship on Sunday, but they don't keep
That's true.
the Sabbath on Sunday.
That's true.
Because they shop, they go out in restaurants, they do everything.
As if it's just a weekday.
It's
Yes.
just a weekend thing.
Yep. Yes, that is so true. You're right. Kay and then Ron.
Well, I guess a lot of you know that I was a Baptist also before I became a Seventh-day Adventist.
Right.
And my family kept Sunday just like the Sabbath.
Really? That's
Yes.
unusual.
And my mother always said, if you work on Sunday, you'll come to nothing. So you never worked. We never mowed the lawn or anything like that. I know my parents had a really hard time when I got to be old enough to drive a car and we wanted to go out and circle around all the fast food drive-ins and see our friends, and they said, that's not something you do, but they allowed it to happen, But it's like Odell said, that I always connected the Sabbath with Sunday. I mean, that's how we were taught. But when I learned the truth, about the Sabbath, it was revolutionary, a thing to me, because I had never connected the two. And it was always, I was taught that Sunday was the Sabbath. And, I mean, that's the way it was. And we didn't know any better, actually.
Yeah.
And that's, there's a question on Monday's lesson about why people feel like we shouldn't keep the Ten Commandments. And I just think that it's a lack of knowledge.
It is. And I think you're absolutely right there. And I was telling Odell earlier this morning that Rita knew right where the Seventh-day Adventist Church was in Bellefontaine. She went by it all the time. She knew where it was. She knew it was the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She had no idea we worshiped on Sabbath. Shame on us for not making that clearer. But she'd go by it all the time, had no idea. Because all she knew about people keeping the Sabbath were the Jews. No idea that there were Christians that did. Ron?
Well, it seems like the Sabbath after Constantine was sort of lost, but wasn't there always some people like the Waldensians, did they keep the Sabbath? I mean, it just seems like the whole world lost that.
But not everybody
But
did.
not everybody.
There were some groups amongst the Waldenses. There were some groups amongst the Albigenses, amongst the Huguenots that did keep the Sabbath. They didn't all keep it, but there were groups amongst them that did. Yeah, the Sabbath has always been kept. Brother Ted.
I'd like to comment on Monday.
Yeah.
Every part of the law must remain in force upon all mankind and in all ages, as not to change but the nature of God, the nature of man, and their unchangeable relation to each other.
That's powerful.
It is, when you stop and think about that, this is telling us of our relationship with God, who we are and who He is. It's just, I think people today just don't like having to deal with the law. In a nutshell, we want to do, if it feels good, do it. And we hate being corrected. People don't like change, and we don't like being told we're wrong. And yet the Bible is very clear that the Sabbath is unchanging.
Exactly. And John Wesley, as you just quoted, knew that, understood that. He didn't keep the Sabbath, but he understood that the law was supposed to be kept. Yes, Joy.
I lived about 15 minutes from the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Toledo, Ohio, and never heard that they were there. Never heard anything about the Seventh-day Adventist at all, or Ellen White, or any of that. I had to move down here to Tennessee and found them because I was working at Tennessee Christian Hospital in Portland,
Okay.
which is an Adventist church, not church, I mean Adventist hospital.
Yeah.
And there I met other Adventists and started going to the Adventist church. And I was so shocked when I realized that, why didn't I ever know this before now?
And that was Rita's experience. She went by that church all the time, knew right where it was, but had no concept that we were Sabbath keepers. Wow.
I was raised Roman Catholic.
Okay. All right.
When I found about it, my girlfriend at the time took me some meetings to an Adventist church, and that's the first time I heard about the Sabbath.
Oh, boy.
So I eventually went to my Catholic priest and brought it up to him.
Yeah, what did he say?
And he told me, well, the Sabbath is Saturday, just like they told me, but they said because of the authority of the church and the Pope, that they had the power to change it because the Pope is God on earth right now, the representative of the Catholic Church. And that he changed the day.
Yeah.
It was Constantine, and he
And then-
explained it to me, and he says, and that's why we keep it. And I told him that I would like to believe the Bible, and he said, well, you don't be a hypocrite, you know. Just go. I think he didn't want me to stay around because he was afraid I talked to other
disrupting things,
people.
yeah.
You know. But,
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. And you're absolutely right. And he was telling the truth. He was telling the truth. We keep right. We keep Sunday because the Pope changed the day. I mean, that's true. That is true.
And you know what? My dad is a jerk. He's stupid, and he won't get baptized. I told him he's going to have to, and I'm going to make sure he does. And he's going to have to fight me over it. He's got a stroke. He can't take me now. I'll fix his ass. So, he'll get him out of the water, and he'll be back to chief like he should be.
I didn't get much of that.
My
Greg.
dad isn't a chief anymore because he's got a stroke. He's
Yeah.
got the E9 chief, though. I wore his uniform once. I wanted to date some girl in the A club. I had to AA before, okay, so they're smart people. But, I just wanted to tell you, you got to do these right. I said, I want to know. He said, you're not alone. Okay, all right, but you're around. I went to 7-Eleven and people, I had one of these folks and I'm filling it up. And so I said, hey, you can't fool me. You're not going to be 20 or give me a toy back. And they told me, case, I don't like beer anyway. So I went to the Life Poorhouse and had Colonel Sanders. And I told them, Colonel Sanders, I know the recipe of chicks. And if you eat a chick out, I like the thing about you know that fairly good. I told them that, and they laughed too. I like whiskey doesn't win. I don't care. I hate a booze, and I don't like booze at all. I like scotch, it's pure liquor.
And
Thank you.
I want us to go on to Tuesday's lesson.
Yep.
Yes. Okay.
We were talking about lack of knowledge. Sometimes people, they want to do God's will, but they just don't know exactly what the Bible teaches. And we had some friends over on Memorial Day. We had my family over and some friends, and they're wonderful Christian people. And we were we got on the subject, of the law and everything, and they said, well, the law's been done away with because we couldn't keep it anyway. And Jesus has kept it, but they said the law, Jesus fulfilled the law, and so it's been done away with. And I heard, who is the representative? Who wrote the book? Mark Finley. He gave an illustration about when you fulfill your marriage vows, do they just go away?
I know where you're going with this one. No way.
No. When you fulfill your marriage vows, you are loving your spouse, and they are
Staying
loving you
together.
back, and you're faithful and everything. I think that was like the best illustration of fulfilling the law. When you fulfill the law, you're
don't do
keeping
away with it.
Right, you don't do away with it.
Right.
It's your
Keep it.
desire to keep the law.
Right. Look at Tuesday's lesson. Oh, brother, go ahead, Brother Doug.
We was visiting a friend of ours in Wisconsin. I think it was Janesville. And we was driving around. I seen a sign there. It said Seventh-day Baptist Church. And the headquarters there in the United States. So I said, I'm going to go in. I went in, I looked at the material. All of their material is written by the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Of course. Of course. Wow. All right, I want to go to Tuesday's lesson and just mention a couple of things here. And the question is asked, what is the relationship between creation, the Sabbath, and the law of God? Let's look at, this is where I want Doug to read, please. Revelation 14, 6 and 7. When we studied the three angels' messages, you were our reader. And so this is the first angel's message, so I want you to read it again for us. Revelation 14, 6 and 7. Doug, please.
Then I saw another angel flying in the midair, and he had eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people. He said in a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and the springs of water."
And to me, those verses right there answer the issue. Look down about in the middle of the page, and the author has written here, the Sabbath points us to a creator, the one who made, who loved us too much to abandon us when we drifted from his purpose for us. The Sabbath is an eternal symbol of our rest in him. It is a special sign of loyalty to the Creator. It is a symbol of rest, not of works, of grace, not of legalism, of assurance, not of condemnation, of depending upon God for salvation, not on ourselves. Wow, I read that and thought, that is fantastic. Whoever wrote that came to the very heart of the issue in those few words. Look at Wednesday's lesson. Look at the title of it. I got to tell this story again. I know some of you have heard me tell it before, but it's possible that somebody has not. Back a number of years ago, I was a member of the Bellefontaine, Ohio church, and one Sunday it burned down. I knew why immediately when I learned that it had burned down. I was walking out the day before with the deacon. We had had a baptism that day. When we got to the lower doorway, we were the last two people out. He said, "I'm going to drain the baptistry," and he opened the pep cup. We left, went home, learned the next day the church had burned down. Why had it burned down? Because he hadn't unplugged the heaters that were in the baptistry. They glowed red hot much of the night until finally they burst into flame. Now, when you drive to Bellefontaine, if I were to drive it today, or if Rita were to, there's a certain place where you come around a corner and you can see the church 1 mile away. The road's real straight there. You can see the church a mile away. Then the road curves again and you wouldn't be able to see it. But I came around that corner and I looked that mile ahead, and the first thing I observed was there was a huge hole in the roof. It was a brick church, so the church building itself stood, but a huge hole in the roof. So I went and looked in the sanctuary. Every pew had this much water sitting in them, and they were solid oak pews. The clock registered, I think it was 11:10. That was when electricity went off. I looked up to what used to be the platform, and everything up front was gone. The baptistry, the pulpit, the communion table, the organ, the piano, everything was gone. There was a huge hole in the floor. So then I went downstairs, and I found the remains of the organ, the piano, all the rest of the things. They had all crashed through the floor right on top of the children's Sabbath school rooms. That was one horrible sight. The pastor called me to tell me it had burned, and then he called me again and he said, "Look, you have a lot more experience than I have. You live much closer to the church than I do. I want you to take care of the rebuilding of it." And so I made some conditions under which I would do it, and so I did it. I contacted a contractor who would oversee the rebuilding, and we shipped the pews to Wapakoneta to a man there that would refinish everything, fix them all up. And there were a whole bunch of people involved. 2 ladies were hired to do the walls, and I remember one time the man that had the pews called me, and he said, "You've got some good oak in these pews, even the ones up front that were so badly scorched. You've got some good oak in them. You don't want to just throw them away." I said, "Well, is there enough good oak that you could take the ends of the pew and shorten the pew so that two people could sit in it? Make it a real short pew and make two of those." He said, "Oh yeah, I can do that." So those went up on the platform to replace the wooden chairs that used to sit there. So now we had two little pews up front to sit in. He called me again. "You still got some good oak there." I said, "Is there enough oak that somebody could make a cross 5 feet high, 3 feet wide out of what's left?" He says, "Oh yeah, no problem." I said, "Look, if you can find somebody that will do that, you keep the rest of the oak for yourself." And he said, "I know just the man for it. He's a Catholic gentleman. He lives here in Wapak. I'll get him to make the cross for you." I said, "That sounds great." Well, months later, the church is all ready. We have the grand reopening. I invite everybody that had anything to do with rebuilding that church to come. Now, the Bell Fountain Church, I was there one time when there were this many people there, 6 of us. That includes the speaker and everybody. 6 people. So it was one tiny church. When we had the grand rededication, there were 104 people there. There was standing room only. The whole police department came. They were standing around the edges because there was no place to sit. It was amazing, the amount of people sitting there. Just incredible crowd. And the pastor had said to me, "Look, you know the people that rebuilt this place. I don't know any of them. You call them up by name, tell the people the role they had in rebuilding things." And then he bought a case of Steps to Christ, hardbound Steps to Christ. He says, "I'll give them the Steps to Christ." I said, "Okay." So I started with the fire department, and I had them all come up. I didn't know all their names. I knew the fire chief, and I knew he knew all their names. So I introduced the fire chief, and he made the comment, that was one hot fire. And we gave him all the Steps to Christ, shook hands with everybody, and then one after another brought up the contractors, brought up everybody that had anything to do with rebuilding that church. And by the way, that church was first built by the members of the church in the 1950s, and it looked like it. They had this unique thought. We're going to hide the lights. So they put them in these, I don't know what you call it, these alcoves. You couldn't see the light. And at night you couldn't see the hymnal either. It was so dark in there, even if the light's on. I mean, it was a ridiculous thing to try to do, but it's what they had. I said, we're not going to do it that way. We put down chandeliers and we put cone lights down the edges so there's lots of illumination in there now. We bought a brand new organ piano. We did it all right. Anyways, comes the day that we're supposed to have the grand rededication, and the place is overflowing with people. Guess what the title of that Sabbath school lesson was? The Mark of the Beast. And we've got all these people here who are not Seventh-day Adventists, one of whom I happen to know is a Catholic, the man that made the cross. What am I going to do now? So my opening words were, title of this week's lesson is The Mark of the Beast, and I'll make this general statement about it. You don't want it. And then from there we went on with our study. But I remember the last person I called forward, the last person was the gentleman, the Catholic gentleman that had made the cross, which was behind me on the wall. And I said to the crowd, when we see the cross, of course, we think of Jesus. But those of us that have been through this fire will also think of what beauty can come from such devastation, because that used to be burned, terribly burned pews. Now it's a beautiful cross. And then I gave the man's name and I asked him to come forward. He was a big man, big man. He got up, sobbing, as if his heart was broken, just sobbing out loud. And he came forward, and he came up on the platform, and the pastor shook his hand, gave him the book. I shook his hand, thanked him for the cross. He went back to his seat, sobbing. Somehow, making that cross for us had so affected him that he was just sobbing his eyes out as he came up. All right, that's what I think of whenever I read about the mark of the beast. I think of that particular event. But I'm going to say the same thing about it today as I did that day. The mark of the beast, you don't want it. There will come a time when everyone will have to make their choice for God or against Him. There is no middle ground. There is only one way that leads to heaven. We either choose God or we choose the devil. There's no other way. I'm going to encourage us to choose the Lord. And the final part, on Thursday, was the three angels' messages, which again is Doug's specialty. He read the first one to us, but we could read them all profitably, but our time is nearly up, and I want you to have a chance to say what you want to say. So anybody have a comment they would want to make? Okay, Brother Ted.
As I was studying this lesson, I was reminded of an old saying that I'd heard a long time ago. As we go through life, we'll have an infinite number of decisions to make until we die. What we don't have is an infinite amount of time. And how we choose to spend that time is really critical. And it's really hard sometimes for people to stop. Just stop. Everything. Come to church and forget about all the things that you have to do. God calls us for 24 hours out of a full week.
Absolutely right. We call it the Sabbath. Praise the Lord for it. Any other comments? I would ask Rita if she has any comments, but she can't very well give them to me right now. Greg.
I don't know if one of her friends, her daughter's friends, was being molested or something like that, for career coach or something, and she spoke up to it and wrote on the book, the safe book or something. He made a big stink of that, and she got thrown out of school, and her kids got thrown out of school too, and they won't talk to Kim, and neither her husband, and I'm pissed. I'm gonna blow their church up.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else a comment? Brother Ted again.
What's the most precious thing you can give to somebody? Almost everything that we have will pass away. The time that we give to somebody, the time that I spent with my parents, that I spend with Kay, that's what I remember most of all. I don't wear the same clothes I wore 50 years ago.
Nor do I.
Yeah. I don't drive the same car.
Right.
I don't live in the same house.
Right.
I don't live in the same state.
Right.
But I worship the same God.
Absolutely. Absolutely, absolutely true. Okay, let's have the closing prayer and end Sabbath school. Father in heaven, I thank you for your word. And we understand from it what your will is for us. Sometimes we're very reluctant to do what you plainly tell us to do, and we're sorry for that. We ask your forgiveness for it. Help us to stand for you, to stand for what is right at all times. We give you all the honor, glory, and power. In Jesus' name, amen.